Damien-Echols, released from Arkansas Department of Correction, Varner Unit in 2011, in an interview with Amy Goodman, makes this chilling statement.
What it all came down to for me was we knew we would win this eventually. We would be exonerated eventually. The state knew that. But they presented this deal to us, basically saying, you can sign this paperwork and you can walk out of prison this week. You can go home before this week is out. Or you can refuse this deal, and yeah, you'll eventually win, but we'll drag this out for another 5, 10 years, however long it takes. You know, Scott Ellington also says in the movie, the prosecutor, that one of the considerations they had in offering, in agreeing to this deal, was that the three of us together could have effectively sued the state for $60 million. So you take that in consideration with the fact that I also knew how corrupt and how desperate they were, and I knew they could have had me stabbed to death in that prison any day of the week for $50. So I knew I would never live to see that exoneration.
Hi, it's Roberta Glass, and today we have on Gary Meese to talk about Damien-Echols, wrongfully incarcerated. Stay tuned. So today I have Gary Meese with us. Gary is the author of 3 books on the West Memphis Three, Where the Monsters Go, Blood on Black, and a condensed version of the 2, The Case Against the West Memphis Three. A self-described newspaper man, Meese has worked as a journalist for the Memphis Commercial Appeal and also as a managing editor of the West Memphis Evening Times. And he knows everything about this case, so I'm really excited to talk to you about Damien-Echols and his wrongful conviction. So the reason why I asked you on around this time is because Damien-Echols and Amanda Knox are doing their Innocence Fraud Act at Town Hall this weekend for the low price of $45. And it's being described as an evening of wrongful conviction. So what's wrong with that sentence?
Damien-Echols was not wrongly convicted.
Good point. Right. He was actually convicted twice.
He pleaded guilty in 2010 to the killings of these 3 little boys in West Memphis. He was found guilty by a court in 1994 of the killings. The appeals courts found him that they upheld those convictions. There's been no exonerating evidence presented. There's not really much of a case beyond what you can see in the Paradise Lost documentaries and arguably west of Memphis that really indicates that he's anything but guilty. Except what you see in the media. And I don't know if you saw this week, but Chloe Sevigny.
Oh, no.
They had a piece about her most valued artifact. The one thing in her home that she would, I suppose, reach for if the place caught on fire. And it was a bird that was made out of soap that Damien-Echols made while he was in prison. Now, Chloe Sevigny, even the story, there's a contradiction there in and of itself, in that she professes not to understand how Damien got this soap bird out of prison when the guards are constantly described as beating him constantly, trying to knock his teeth out, forcing him to eat without eating utensils, starving him, et cetera, and yet he was able to get his artwork out of prison.
Amazing.
There's a contradiction there, but she doesn't. It totally goes by her. As with most supporters in this case, they choose to overlook the obvious to go for the not so obvious conclusion that damien-echols is in fact innocent of this crime. Though there's nothing legally to back that up, and there's nothing in the massive facts to back that up.
And quite a lot of money was spent by the best lawyers, the best defense attorneys, the best appeals lawyers to find some piece of evidence that would get them out of prison or exonerated. And the best they could do was plead guilty. But what would you say to supporters who say, well, if you were in the same position as damien-echols, you would plead guilty even if you were innocent?
Well, I might if I were in the same position that he was in, but being actually guilty and getting the deal of a lifetime, literally. He was on death row, so I mean, it was a next ticket off death row, and that's not a small thing. However, his case, this plea was engineered by the defense, and as recently as a week or so ago, he described it as something that was offered to him. No, his side offered it to the state. And as a deadline neared for them to present exonerating DNA, any exonerating DNA evidence that their millions and millions of dollars, $10 to $20 million was available to them. No accountability for how it was spent, but some of it was obviously spent on high-priced attorneys, PR people like John Douglas, who's going to be moderating this event with Amanda Knox and damien-echols.
And Joe Berlinger.
Yeah, and Joe Berlinger, etc. Douglas wrote a part of one of his books he devoted to the West Memphis Three case, and he got a lot of things wrong in there, particularly when he described all three of the killers as having no violence in their backgrounds, when in fact all three of them had a lot of violence in their backgrounds. And it's all on record. Some of it's from the killers themselves.
And they've all confessed, and they've all confessed at various times or another. All three of them.
Well, yes, and Jason Baldwin, for instance, as far as we know about known violence, most of what we know about him comes from his own, the things that he said himself, that he choked out his little brother. He wrote a school paper about how he choked out his little brother on one occasion when he got very, very angry. He wrote in Dark Star by Mara Leverett, who's made a career out of writing about the West Memphis Three. She wrote this really hagiography, however you pronounce it. Anyway, he described Baldwin as some sort of saint who entered prison and also a little tough guy who just, managed to win over the whole inmate, all the inmates with the power and force of his personality and the strength of his body. And he's a little wimpy guy, but, he managed to whip them all at some point. But anyway, he in there he describes, it's like read with the proper eye, it's like a description of a sociopath at work, how a sociopath would enter and thrive in a prison environment. Baldwin grew up in a alcoholic household with a mentally ill mother. Mm-hmm. A lot of violence there. He proudly described how he chased his stepfather out of the home just weeks before the killing with a baseball bat. That's from his own words. Echols is known animal torture, is described by Jason Baldwin's cousin, confirmed by other witnesses.
Cat killing too, via firecracker.
Right. Sticking sticks through frogs, and I think he blew up cats too, if I recall correctly. He set fires at the school. He was suspended for fighting. He tried to pluck out the eyes of his romantic rival with his inch-long vampire fingernails. Mm-hmm. Inch and a half, actually, filed to points. This in the year or so before, actually a little bit over a year before the killings took place in 1993. So there's all this violence, and Jesse Miskelly was on probation for beating up on a little girl. Like, I think she was 8 or 10 or something like that, just months before he was arrested for this killing. He's the third of the killers. And he had a long history of violence.
And that was really shocking when I read your book, that he was also throwing rocks at girls, too, not just beating up other boys, but hitting girls, young girls. That's what was also shocking about Jesse Miskelly that I didn't know before I read your book.
He'd thrown a rock and hit like a 6-year-old in the head. He'd beaten up this other little 8 or 10-year-old girl. He'd stabbed a classmate in an earlier grade. He'd stabbed a classmate with a pencil through the cheek. He had taken a knife to various, people who knew him. I've taken a knife to another so-called friend of his or acquaintance, threatened to kill him. Baldwin and Echols are described by some of their acquaintances as joking about how they'd like to find some bums and kill them, set them on fire, etc. These were violent teenagers who were prone to violence. Miskelly describes in his first of his many confessions capturing and torturing animals.
Oh, and they were also involved. Jesse Miskelly. We'll get to his confessions in just a bit, but he also describes a cult where they ate dogs. That this crime on May 5th, 1993, which was the killing of 3 8-year-old boys, Michael Moore, Stevie Branch, and Chris Byers. He describes it as the end, kind of like the end product or a goal of a cult that got together every Wednesday. Is that right?
That's what he described. He toned it down, and he did many confessions,
right?
And just the ones that are really confessions, he confessed to the police in June of 1993. The day he was convicted, as he was being driven to prison, he confessed to 2 state troopers. His defense attorney heard about this, said he wanted to he wanted to talk to Jesse about this. He went in and took a Bible in and had Miskelly confess with his hand on a Bible, and Miskelly went through again the same gruesome story of capturing and torturing these little children in secluded woods in West Memphis, Arkansas. After that, the prosecutors in the company with the defense attorneys in attendance heard another detailed confession from Jesse Miskelly. And there was another confession, which is not recorded anywhere, but did take place, where he confessed again to prosecutors as they were preparing for the trial against Jason Baldwin and damien-echols. They were tried. The 3 were tried separately. Miskelly was tried first, and then Baldwin and Echols. Part of what happened with the release of these, in 2010 was they were coming up to they had gotten an approval for an evidentiary hearing. It was set for that December. In August, they were released in August under this Alford plea, which does allow them to proclaim their innocence even while they're pleading guilty. And it's a kind of a plea deal, admittedly. But part of what was happening is besides that, there were allegations that there was some jury misconduct, and that's often cited as something that would surely have granted them a new trial. However, it was never challenged in court, and the jury foreman who's been accused of this adamantly denies it. The attorney who says he knew about this waited many, many years to report it, which means as an officer of the court, he was at least derelict in his duty. So I don't know that the Supreme Court of Arkansas would have signed off on a new trial on that basis. That's unproven. They also had all these confessions that I've just talked about on the record to consider if they were going to grant new trials to these three men. And looking at the confessions over and over again with the consistent details that Miskelly describes in confession after confession, and supporters of the West Memphis Three focus on two things that Miskelly deliberately misled investigators on early on, which was in the first confession, which was the time of the day in which he makes a ridiculous claim that this happened in the morning of May 5th, 1993, when it happened in the evening. The boys were in school. The boys that were killed, Stevie, Michael, and Chris, were in school that day. And Jason Baldwin was in school that day. So it couldn't have happened then. And no one thought it did, and that can't be taken seriously. He also claimed that they were tied with ropes when they were tied with their own. They were bound in a very strange manner that had a ritualistic aspect to it. They were stripped nude, tied with their own shoestrings, what's described as being hog-tied. However, it wasn't the kind of hog-tie. It was right to right, left to left, which isn't really hog-tying because it doesn't really immobilize somebody who just simply, if you're alive, you can just wiggle around and get out of that very easily. So it had some other motive other than immobilizing someone, and it's not clear what that is. Damien-Echols could probably tell us what he was thinking when he did that, but he never will.
They were very drunk, too, correct?
They were what?
Very drunk, too.
Oh, yeah. They were very drunk, and in the confession that Miskelly gave with his hand on the Bible, he described how he and this friend of his got somebody else who figured in the case, Victoria Hutchison, who agreed that she bought this bottle of whiskey for these boys. He was 17 at the time, about to turn 18. She agreed she bought this bottle of Evans Williams whiskey for these boys, 2 bottles, and Jesse had one and his friend had another. And then Miskelly took the bottle of whiskey and went with him to meet with Baldwin and Echols as they had arranged. They walked over, it's not that far from the trailer parks where they were living over to the woods, and the woods are conveniently located between exactly between Damien-Echols' home and where Jason Baldwin and Miskelly lived. Anyway, he walked over there and took the whiskey with him. Damien and Jason were drinking beer. They were drunk when this happened, and it could be reasonably postulated that this was simply 3 drunken bullies who got out of control, and that's not an unreasonable theory of the crime. But that's pretty much what Miskelly describes, but he does describe the assaults very, very similarly throughout all these confessions. He describes how strangely enough, he protected Michael Moore from being cut up like the other 2 boys were by Jason Baldwin. But essentially he beat Michael Moore. He would have beaten him to death, except Michael drowned before he had time to die from his head injuries. The 2 boys, two of the boys, Stevie Branch had horrible wounds to his face, which might have been fatal ultimately. I doubt it, but as far as the face wounds, but all 3 of them had their heads heavily beaten and each of them had been punched in the head in a ritualistic fashion with something like a stick at the very top. In many ways, this accords with the pagan ideal of ritual sacrifice, in which the object that's the human being that's given to the gods is killed in a threefold fashion. They found bog bodies in England that were killed in this fashion, and there was a book that came out just about the time that Damien was haunting the libraries of West Memphis in 1992, 1993, called The Life and Death of a Druid Prince, which describes exactly this, except slightly different, but basically it was cutting, choking, and drowning. In this case, Christopher Byers was sexually mutilated, and he died from blood loss. The other two boys died from drowning. He was beaten about the head in such a fashion that would have killed him, and then he was placed in water. That is a threefold death. And let me tell you something. Damien-Echols describes in his own writings how he encountered this book about the witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts in the 1600s, with these illustrations of how these witches were tortured and tested. And that included binding and drown. The old test, if you float, you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the standard back then. Well, he describes in his own words, in his own book, how he would go to sleep every night with these visions going through his head. In other words, he had been visualizing this kind of death from like maybe not early childhood, but late childhood up until the time of the killings. It fascinated. This is speculation, but I think it fascinated him. It terrified him, I'm sure, but also fascinated him, and he has shown nothing but an interest and fascination with this sort of thing ever then and now.
Right. When they found this storage locker, there was writings about, a picture of his wife tied up with a ball gag in her mouth. He propositioned some West Memphis Three supporter that he wanted to hog tie her, right? And I wondered what that would be like to be on the other side of that as a woman. Like, oh, you're such an innocent martyr. Can I hog tie you? Oh, maybe not. Maybe not so much. But it seems to, this. That was also a really interesting part of your book, was that these obsessions started really early on, and he describes this book, which he describes as Devils and Fiends, which I'm sure was not the title. I think he even knows the title and isn't giving it. I had that impression, too, that he really remembered this book really well. And that his mother gave him some information on the occult. So do you think Pam Echols was interested in the occult or taught him some of it?
I just don't know. He wrote something... there's a lot of speculation about that, but I don't know. I know that she claimed she seemed to be authentically concerned when, he went to mental institutions 3 times over the summer months of 1992, all for violent acts of one sort or another, and including sucking blood. The last instance, the middle instance was threatening to kill his parents and himself.
Right.
And the earlier instance was threatening to hang himself, and he seemed to be fixated on various violent fantasies about what he was going to do to other people who had gotten him into this fix that he was in with his then girlfriend, or his girlfriend at that time that he was separated from, Deanna Holcomb. They were both very much tied into the occult, and the idea that there was no occult activity in Brittany County at that time is just simply false. I'm not saying that it was malicious, all of it was malicious or with some sort of evil intent, but it's just documented, and it's on the record that there were some kids practicing witchcraft at that time, and they're fine. It's as long as they don't kill anybody. I'm not sure anybody really cares that much. I mean, I know some people do, but they didn't. Nobody burned down nobody in West Memphis ran out and burned any of those kids' houses down or ran them out of town. It just didn't happen. This whole idea that they were persecuted because of their occult beliefs is ridiculous. The whole idea that they were persecuted because of black T-shirts is ridiculous.
That was my next question.
what's particularly pernicious and ridiculous is the idea that they were persecuted because they were fans of Metallica. Number one, how would the West Memphis police even be aware of what their musical tastes were? And number two, why would they care? Metallica was one of the biggest bands in the world at the time, and there were plenty of fans of Metallica in West Memphis. It's not a little bitty town. It's 20,000 people or so. Add on Marion, where they live. Most of them live between Marion. Echols claims he rarely went into West Memphis. He said this on the air. He lived in West Memphis, but his two friends lived in these Miskelly and Baldwin lived in these trailer parks that are located between Marion, Arkansas, and West Memphis, Arkansas, which are more or less right next to each other, and not 10 or 15 miles apart, as Echols suggested in another interview. He's a continual master of misdirection and out lying, and nothing stops him. He just continues on with it. It's very typical of a certain type of person who lacks a conscience. And since Echols described himself in his Social Security disability benefit application as a sociopath, I don't mind calling him one, though I'm not sure that's what he actually is. I think he's probably a pathological narcissist, but, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know. He had a wealth of different diagnoses from these trips to the mental hospital, and he was continuing to be treated up until the time of the killings. In fact, the very day of the killings, he had a meeting with a mental health, I think he was a psychiatrist, may have been a social, he may have been some sort of social worker, but I think he was a psychiatrist who wrote notes on him and said he had violent tendencies that very day. So it's not, there were many warning signs there. He was a reasonable person to look at, along with many other people. It's a very strange sort of community. There are a lot of you read the record, and there seem to be an awful lot of drug addicts, alcoholics, and most disgustingly, sexual predators just creeping through the whole record, one after another after another. There are also a lot of kids who are talking about involvement in occult practices tied in with sex, including rape and torturing of animals.
And which brings me to, do you think that Echols is a pedophile?
I don't know. I think technically, I'm just hesitant to say anything because I don't know what his, I have no reason to think he's done. I have no proof that he's done anything but what he's been actually been convicted of. Mm-hmm. But there was evidence that there was sexual assaults going on in this case. Excuse me. Stevie Branch, in particular, had injuries to his penis that indicated it had been roughly handled. And Miskelly, in his confessions, describes Miss Echols doing just that very thing. There was some evidence that they may have simulated some sort of, for lack of anal intercourse, may have simulated without actually penetrating it, just from the wounds that were found on the boys. This was described by another sexual predator in the case, James K. Martin, who, if he probably should have been looked at closer as a good suspect, but he was a sex offender who seemed to have an awful lot of special knowledge about how you would pull off this sort of crime. I don't think he did it, and I think it's the West Memphis Three. There's just too much evidence suggesting otherwise, including polygraph reports. Echols and Miskelly both failed polygraphs. Buddy Lucas, who heard Jesse Miskelly's confession the next day on May 5th, 1993, Buddy Lucas, a friend, heard Miskelly tell him with tears in his eyes about how he had gone over to West Memphis with Baldwin and Echols and hurt some boys without getting in a lot of detail about it.
And gave him his sneakers, correct?
He passed a polygraph test.
Okay.
Excuse me a moment.
Sure.
There was another friend who was with him almost all day, but just sort of magically disappeared during the evening. He had to go home and babysit or something. Kenneth Little Bit Watkins. And it's amazing, Marl Everett's book, Devil's Knot, you won't find a mention of people like Kenneth Watkins, Chris Luttrell, Murray Ferris, and other important figures in this case. They just simply don't exist as far as she's concerned. Anyway, Ken Watkins described Echols confessing to him within a week or two after the killings. And during a walk, he didn't describe the involvement of anybody else to Kenneth Watkins. Kenneth Watkins took a polygraph test, which indicated that indeed he told the truth about this, even though he denied it. He denied it on the test that it was true, but it showed he was lying. In other words, they indicated deception when he said he was lying, which means he was truth.
Right.
The amount of lying that goes on in this case, I think it's probably true in many police investigations, but it's incredible. The people who contradict themselves constantly. But so that indicates that. There was another boy who also heard, and he was on record right up, and they expected to have these three boys testify in these various trials. William Jones heard Echols testify to him about killing these boys when he was drunk within that month before he was arrested. All three of the boys got, Buddy Lucas, William Jones, Kenneth Little Bit Watkins, all got scared off of testifying when an investigator for the defense, Ron Lax, who's now departed, dropped by their homes and just sort of gently warned them that they might be getting themselves into more than they bargained for by testifying against Damien-Echols, Chris and Jason Baldwin and Miss Kelly.
Wow.
So he scared them off the case. They were all not too happy about talking to police to begin with. So
can you talk a little bit about Damien-Echols stalking young girls in the neighborhood?
Yes. There's some of it might be, there's at least one instance of it that might be a case of a girl just simply thinking, a little bit of teenage girl hysteria, but or teenage hysteria, because I think it's pretty common to both sexes. But he was involved in, there was a police report in which this one girl had somebody stalking outside her home, saying, I'm going to kill you, bitch, something to that effect. Outside the bedroom window, or outside of her kitchen window, I think it was. And she didn't tell police who it was at the time because she was scared of it. But it turned out it was Damien-Echols. There was another instance that was reported. It's not in my book. He was at Walmart or something and with some girl, and she describes how he was joking about how heads were going to be rolling down the aisle, how he was going to have heads rolling down the aisles of the store, severed heads. Just this sort of morbid humor. He liked to shock. He liked and still likes to be the object of attention. He does and says things to shock and get attention. He did it in West Memphis, Arkansas. He does it now. It's all about Damien. It's all about self-promotion. There's his Facebook page and his Twitter feed is all about the products he's happy to sell you that he will profit from, and all about how his magical beliefs, and very little about anything else. He doesn't seem to care a great deal about anybody else or anything else. This day, his own mother describes when his sister Michelle was brought in they went exactly a year before. Excuse me a second. I'm afraid this is going to happen with the cough. A year before exactly a year before the killings, the Echols family was forced into counseling because Echols' sister Michelle accused his stepfather, Jack Echols, of sexually molesting her. And a lot of the session notes very predictably revolve around Damien, his behavior, his attitude. His mother complained that he had this attitude that he was better than everybody else and that he knew it all. He was very intelligent. The rest of them were stupid, and that he knew more than anyone else. And, that is a phenomena that was noted in many of the psychological reports that came out in the exhibit offered by the defense called Exhibit 500, which goes over his psychological history with the Social Security disability and his 3 trips to mental hospitals. I think you used to have this thing on the podcast where we'll talk about wolves and sheep. Well, that's practically a direct quote from Damien-Echols, where he talks about how some people are wolves and some are sheep, and he's a wolf.
And strangely, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
And strangely, Amanda Knox said, either I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing or I'm you, which she ripped off from somebody else. And that's also something Damien-Echols is great at, which is just ripping off things from other people and claiming it's his own. And so when I was thinking about what to call my show, I called it The Wolf and Sheep, because I thought that represented so well some of these killers' view of the people that support them and some of the dynamics involved in the crimes themselves. But it's a constant in his from such an early age that he thought that no human beings had any love for one another. Everybody just used one another. When he was in prison, he said, I just want to do what's good for me, and I'm not going to give anything unless I get something in return, and F everything else. And recently I saw an interview where he was talking about true crime podcasts and cases and says, well, if you read and watch and listen to shows about true crime, you're going to be an unhappy person because you put your energy towards that. And I thought, wow, you're just still missing it. It's human connection. It's giving to others. That's like the whole, that's the whole secret to life, and living a happy life is being connected to other people.
Right, and some of it, Roberta, is the human fascination with something so strange as people who really don't have that human connection. It seems like a different species, and I don't mean that in any other way than that. That is just the impression. It's like they're operating on a different system, because they are.
Yeah,
they are out to use. Most people aren't out to do that. They are out to use, and you can call it whatever label you want to put on it: sociopathy, antisocial disorder, psychopathy, whatever. It doesn't make any difference as far as the label, but the behavior is a reflection of the emptiness inside. All they have is their little empty selves to live with, and they keep trying to fill that up with one way or another. Echols really landed on something wonderful for him, if no one else, when he found magic at such an early age. Because I don't know, maybe he would have gotten into rebuilding cars or something more productive. But that system allows him to focus on himself, be uninvolved with other people, and really be standoffish. He allows him to seek the power that he so desperately wants and will never have, because he really wants to. It is a means to be a kind of a god, which he proclaimed that he felt like he was an alien from another world. He claimed that he was growing more godlike in his abilities all the time. At one point, he was eating packs of Kool-Aid and feeling his body change. He claimed he was in communion with various historical figures and mysterious. He claimed a woman. He was being persecuted when he came back from Oregon. He was being persecuted by an older female witch,
Rosie. Rosie, who could forget her, of course.
Right. And then he had this entity that he was in communion with constantly. He called Rosie, which is just all very mysterious sort of thing. And this just goes on and on and on. And he's obviously he's obviously deluded in many ways. However, it's striking, when he chooses to, he seems to be able to exhibit great focus and control. And I sometimes think that much of his so-called insanity was just an act. There was at least one psychiatrist who speculated, or one psychiatrist in Oregon who suggested that's exactly what was going on. This was a means of manipulation, that he actually knew perfectly well what he was doing. So he might be a little depressed. Maybe he was like every other teenager. Huh?
That is Meredith's theory too. About damien-echols, that he faked a lot of his hallucinations and craziness just to get attention. So,
right. His mother, Damien's mother, who's been very, very ill lately, she from an early age, she exhibited signs of that she was mentally ill on some level, and maybe she just had an extreme case of agoraphobia or something, but she seemed to be unable to function in any kind of normal way. His father was very, very strange, constantly moving, seemed to be paranoid. So he was, and the family, one of their favorite activities as a family was to watch horror movies together. So little Damien describes his happy memories of staying up late with his father watching horror movies on TV. And I think his parents separated when he was 7 or 8 years old. So he was a small child watching horror movies with his parents at an early age. The family was grossly dysfunctional, and no one disagrees with that. I don't think Echols disagrees with that.
Right.
But it doesn't excuse, and his reading about his early life and even about his life in high school, it's hard not to feel sorry for him at some point, because look, I grew up as a nerd in a small southern town. I know what it's all about. I know about getting your books thrown in the ditch, but you grow up and get over it. And actually, it was a great place to grow up. I'm not complaining about it. But he was able to take all that and somehow turn it in where it became all about him all the time. And it continues on and on and on.
So we're running out of time, but it's kind of a good place to leave it, because he continues succouring his supporters and reaping the benefits for himself, while the victims and the victim's family get the pain brought up all over again.
Yeah, we could. That's the most troubling thing, is the families keep getting drawn back into it. And, as most people who follow the case know, there's been 2 of the parents who have been accused at various times of actually having committed the crimes with little or no evidence to that effect. So that's very, very troubling. And it's hard enough even for the family members who have managed to stay out of that.
Absolutely.
And John Douglas is responsible for a lot of this, by the way. He's the one who's created many of the later problems. So hats off to John Douglas for a job well done, if that's what your intent was.
terrible. So thank you, Gary Meese. I'm going to have you back on, or try to have you back on again, try to convince you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.